Hello and welcome to the CFB Super Show, Week 12 edition. I'm your host, Walter Waddell, aka Deuce85, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, co-pilot, partner in crime, Jake Kuchek. We're going to break down this entire 12-game slate, packed with all kinds of Pac-12. And we gave a lot of those games to Jake because, I've been hogging the Pac-12, and I really had to share my toys a little bit with my brother here. We have a fantastic show planned. We're going to be talking about not only the slate breakdown for both DraftKings and a little bit of FanDuel love, but we'll also be talking PrizePicks and prop bets, any betting opportunities there as well. There is still the promotion going on. If you use the code NIGHTHOOPS, gets you your first month off any subscription at ftndaily.com. That is a huge discount off the first month. You get access to written content, Discord shows, pre-lock shows, optimizers, all the tools that we offer, projections, anything you could possibly need at your disposal with FTN. Great deal indeed. Appreciate everyone who continues to support the Super Show, whether it's the CFB version or the CFB version. Please make sure you hit the like button, share, comment, do all that good stuff. Been pushing it up there. It's been getting a lot of new looks, and I'm very grateful. People ask me sometimes, hey, how can I help you out? Never ask for tips or anything. The way you can help is by helping me promote the show and interacting with us as we record. I am here with Jake. I am doing very well. How are you, Jake? How is your evening going, and how has your week been?
Doing well, man. Still riding high after the Jalen Milroe call. Had a lot of him, and I was kind of on Jalen Milroe Island. But very low owned. He was like 5% in some of the bigger GPPs, and that was a pretty good start to the day. Got things going pretty well, and he could not be stopped, and he looks great. And I don't know if Kentucky's just bad or he figured something out or what happened, but man, that was a phenomenal performance. Cannot say the same for Ollie Gordon. Like, this was, we were like, nobody can stop Ollie Gordon. Turns out, yeah, he can actually be stopped, just like anybody else. And so took a little bit of the wind out of my sails with Ollie Gordon being kind of a letdown, and I didn't get as much exposure to Cody Schrader as I would have liked to. Especially because Luther Burden was playing. We had talked about that, and I was very heavy Cody Schrader going into it, thinking Burden wasn't going to be able to go, and then backed off of a little bit. So kicking myself because it could have been a phenomenal day and turned out just being a pretty good one, but we'll take pretty good days too.
Yeah, and I mean, hindsight's undefeated, but we can sit here all day and be like, why did we play Ollie Gordon? But we know why we played one of the best running backs in the entire country. And yeah, I had a bad game. I was very happy with the way Taj Brooks started. He was super low owned, way unexpected. And then for some reason, the second half of that game just died. He was off to such a good start. Still had a good day, but could have had an even bigger day. And then also, I ran the 4 running backs. RJ Harvey rushed for 206 yards on the other side of that Oklahoma State game, trying to tell people, hey, Oklahoma State's rush defense is pretty putrid as well as UCF's. And Harvey had himself a very, very nice day. I think he scored 3 touchdowns as well. So definitely ended up being pretty solid on the at least the leverage calls that we pride ourselves on. So I'm very, very pleased with that as well. All right, we're going to jump into it here and get into the game-by-game slate breakdown immediately. And we're going to start things off with the Oklahoma Sooners versus BYU Cougars. 24-point favorites are Oklahoma. BYU's got their struggles, their injuries, and all kinds of stuff. But it is a total of 58, and the over, I think, is very, very in play. Kick us off with this one, my good sir.
Yeah, man, this comes down to like one of the decisions we've been going after all season. Dylan Gabriel in a cake matchup that you would ordinarily think, okay, it's going to be a blowout. Is Dylan Gabriel going to be able to pay off that 9.8? But I mean, 5 passing touchdowns and 3 rushing touchdowns last week in very much also a blowout. How do you fade that, right? And so, I don't think that BYU is going to be able to put up much of a fight. So it comes down to, do you think that Dylan Gabriel puts the keeps the pedal to the metal. And is that offense going to, continue to pile on points? And I don't see any reason why they wouldn't at this point. What are they saving him for? So yeah, I think Dylan Gabriel is very much in play. 9,800. He is not the top quarterback on the slate. He's close. Got Caleb and got Bo Nix above him. I don't know why Caleb's 10-9. We'll get into that, I guess, later. But I very much think that Dylan Gabriel's in play here. If you're going to go that route and play him, we got to talk about the Drake Stoops game, because we have thought about Drake Stoops as kind of an underneath possession receiver that'll get you 14 to 18 points every week, and be reliable, but at like a mid to high 6 price point. Like, that's not really something that is overly exciting. And then Drake Stoops went out and put up 10, 164 and 3 against West Virginia. And so I think most of that is like everybody else kind of is either hurt or ineffective. And he's just got the most chemistry with Drake Stoops. And he's shown that with Nick Anderson too. I mean, Nick Anderson had that crazy run of touchdowns at the beginning of the year that we very well documented and have been on. And he's only really had the one bad game against Kansas. And unfortunately, that's, a game that it made a lot of sense to use him. So, we didn't get him that week, but Nick Anderson at 6'3" is just as viable. I think could be just as likely to have a crazy Drake Stoops goes off kind of game. And I feel like a lot of the ownership will probably flock to Drake Stoops because of that, and he had a great game the week before too, 12-1, 34-1 against Oklahoma State in what was a tougher matchup for Oklahoma. And so there's validity to using both of them, or possibly even using both of them in the same lineup. This is just basically if you were in on Gabriel, you kind of have to be in on one of the receivers to unlock all of that upside. Yes, he rushes them in, but the receiving room is concentrated enough with Stoops and Anderson, and Farouk's kind of taking a back seat. He's there too, but it's either going to be Stoops or Anderson. Probably, if you're going to take a side on that, great, but I would feel comfortable using, all three of Gabriel, Stoops, and Anderson in a lineup, just because they seem to want to pile up the points. On the other side of it, we're not going to talk about BYU quarterbacks, whether it's Slovis or Retzlaff, kind of doesn't matter. They're not going to be great. There's not a lot of talent there. Ordinarily, I would say it's been okay spot to attack the Oklahoma running game, but haven't really seen much out of Aiden Robbins in conference play. And he's been good to us in years past when he was at UNLV, but right now it's tough sledding against tougher defenses and splitting some carries with LJ Martin as well. The only real place to have a run back in this would be the receivers. And that is a little bit of a challenge too. I mean, Chase Roberts has kind of been our guy at times. 5'4" Chase Roberts is kind of a tall ask. I don't know that I want to get there, even if we have some injuries to Darius Lassiter, who may be coming back. We'll have to keep an eye on that. Cody Epps, has had some involvement at times, not really a place that I want to go. Isaiah Rex is probably the most interesting of the run backs, just because you do get that discount, get him at 4K. But it's weird to say, but I kind of just want to only take the Oklahoma side, and I want a lot of pieces of that. And then in the running game, I mean, Dylan Gabriel's rushing for multiple touchdowns a game, which takes work away from, and it could be Walker, it could be Sawchuk at this point. They're, Walker at 6'2", Sawchuk at 5'5". Neither of them is significantly discounted enough for me to be super interested. It's kind of just Gabriel and whichever pass catcher or pass catchers you want to pair with him for me in this one. And if you want to use Rex as a run back, that's acceptable, but by no means necessary.
Makes sense. we had some injuries in this Oklahoma backfield a couple weeks ago when they faced UCF, and I was all in on Gavin Sawchuk. I know he had a rough start, ended up finishing fine. Since then, he's kind of started to assume the leading role. I know Walker's still there, but he was so awful against West Virginia. They kind of just kept running Sawchuk. So obviously 4-2 would have been a better price, but I think at 5-5, we may end up seeing or staring down the barrel of a lot of Sawchuk ownership there in single entry. So if you're taking a stand on the passing game, and Sawchuk doesn't do well, or say Barnes rises from the dead, Undertaker style, then you could have yourself a little bit of leverage there. But I feel like we were the early ones on Sawchuk, so I do like him to a degree. But there's a lot of other options on this slate that I also like. But he's definitely in my back pocket and somebody that I'm considering at this point. All right, we're going to move right along here. Next game, Louisville versus Miami. Miami is 1-point favorite. Might as well be a pick 'em. 46.5 over under. When we start on the Louisville side, it's just tough. Jack Plummer is really just never in play, and especially not in play at 8-7. It confuses me why his price is not down there at 6-2 like it was last year when he was not a member of Louisville. But I guess DK is just like, nope, as soon as we price him down, he's going to go off, and they're guarded against that. So we can obviously never use him at that price point. Typically, you're looking at somebody in the backfield for Louisville, and we've seen a lot of ownership on Jawar Jordan this season, and he's had some really good games. He is priced a little high for my liking at 7-2, especially for the fact that Isaac Guerendo is kind of, chipping away at his workload there. Jawar Jordan's still getting the majority, but, Guerendo, 6 carries last week, had 94 yards, had a reception as well. The week before that, he had another 12 touches. So he's just kind of taking 8 to 12 away, and it's enough to kind of take that top end upside off of Jordan. Now, I'd like to use Guerendo, but we're not even getting a discount on him at 6-5 either, and they're going up against a Miami defense that is a lot better than I think most people probably realize. In the receiving room, you have a bunch of cheap guys, exciting guys, except for Jamari Thrash, who I think is always an elite GPP type of play. Was banged up a little bit there. Hasn't been great the last 2 games. This will be a game they definitely need him. Miami has a tendency to give up fantasy points to WR1s, but this is a very steep price, and it goes against the type of builds I'm normally doing each week, which is pay down at receiver whenever possible. There are some expensive receivers on this slate that I do like and think we might have to play, but Jamari Thrash is just not one of them. But you do have a 2% play here or less that could pop off at any time, honestly. He has 71 targets, 49 catches, almost 750 yards and 6 touchdowns. Guy's the real deal, no doubt. On the Miami side, kind of unexcited about Tyler Van Dyke as well. There was a time where I wanted the Seahawks to draft Van Dyke when he came out. That has come and gone for me. He's maybe not going to play the entire game. I don't know. This just kind of seems weird with the situation there. It's just all bad for quarterbacks in this game. Running backs are very good for Miami. I think Louisville is pretty stout overall defensively as well. This game kind of comes off as being one that the under looks good to me. And there got like 3 or 4 guys who are going to ban touches in the backfield as well. The wide receivers on Miami continue to be pretty cheap outside of Restrepo, whose price has gone up as he's continued to produce, although he's been pretty ordinary the last few games. They've been playing some tougher matchups as well, at least last week. I do like Kobe Young a lot, still at 4.3. He's a better than what we normally get option at sub 4.5. He is somebody who started the season off really, really well, kind of fell off after he got knocked out early in one of those early games. And he hasn't, I don't know if he got his bell rung or what, but he hasn't quite been the same. He hasn't been the volume hound that I kind of expected him to be, but he has been a pretty safe option in terms of he's still churning out 8 to 10 fantasy points pretty regularly. So at 4.3, normally we're down here scraping the bottom of the barrel looking for these cheap receivers like, hey, who can I throw in here? And we got, this guy, 2 weeks ago, he caught a touchdown. 7 weeks ago, he had 5 for 50. Like, at least with him, we know he's going to get at least, 3 to 5 targets minimum, and there's potential for more there as well. I do feel like defensive battle is certainly on the table with this one, and there's quite a few games like that. But I am looking at a potential of starting my day off with a value price Colby Young there. Looking at the Miami targets, Restrepo leads with 85, 68 for Jacoby George, and then Colby Young there with 53. They're all pretty similar with their touchdown totals as well. So George is the guy that's going to be heavily involved. They have several other options that pilfer targets here or there in the running backs as well, but this is an offense that typically is pretty exciting for GPPs, but just not this week at all. So I will save my long-winded responses that I normally have for another game and move us along to the next one, unless you really have something you want to say about it. Nope. All right.
So you kind of froze up.
Okay.
At the end.
Gotcha. Did you have anything you wanted to add there on the Miami game before I move us along?
No, I'm ready to jump into the next one.
All right, so we're going to jump into Rutgers, Penn State. Penn State 20.5-point favorites, total of 41. I am just so tired of waiting for these Penn State running backs to do anything that we're used to them doing from last year. I'm kind of I'm not writing them off, but I'm just not using Penn State ever. And this would be a matchup you'd think the running game would be strong in, but at this point, outside of GPPs, I just don't know what I can do with these guys. So bring it down and tell us about Penn State versus Rutgers.
Yeah, man. So obviously, tough game for Penn State. Physical loss last week. Kind of got literally run into the ground against Michigan. Probably looking to take some frustrations out, and I think they're gonna, probably pound the rock themselves this one. That said, 6-3-6 for Singleton and Allen is quite a bit. If these guys were down in the low fives, it's a little bit more enticing. But or if one of them we're going to take a back seat and they weren't splitting carries evenly, that would be another route where it would be interesting. But yeah, I'd love to get on them. I've been trying to do it all season, hasn't really worked out, and so. I think Penn State is still going to, dominate this game, dominate time of possession. I don't know how much of it is going to translate into fantasy goodness. I don't really have an interest in using Aller at 7-8. I do think he'll play a decent game, probably go for 202 or 250 or something like that. And that's fine, but that's not really what you want at 7-8. And it's just, there's so much opportunity cost to using a quarterback. So not in there. I do have a little bit of interest in some of the lower end passing options. I mean, Keandre Lambert-Smith is always going to be the volume guy. At 5'8", it's probably one of the lower prices we've seen him at this season. He's kind of been, a 6K plus guy all year. And so I get the potential interest in Keandre Lambert-Smith here. Not something I'm looking to force, but it is interesting as, a game that Penn State should look to control pretty easily. We did see Dante Cephas flash against Maryland and end up being terrible against Michigan, but most receivers are going to be terrible against Michigan. I do like Dante Cephas at 4.9 as a little bit of a sneak. Not, definitely a GPP look, not putting him in a single entry or main lineups at all. But for him to have shown the explosiveness to go for 653 and 2 at Maryland a couple weeks ago, I think they at least trust him enough to look to him, and he got a couple catches in the Michigan game, didn't really do much, but definitely a low ownership type of play. And then the same goes for Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren as well. The tight ends, they do try to mix in the tight ends quite a bit to their passing game. Theo Johnson at 4 and Tyler Warren at 3,600. Both are going to be heavily involved in any red zone work, somewhat to the detriment of the running backs. And so if you're looking for a very cheap piece of this passing game that will get, some looks in the red zone, those are some interesting places to go. On the Rutgers side, hard to get there. Pretty tough nails defense that they're going to be going up against. cheap running back, Monangai, not great on the pronunciation there. Pretty high volume back. Has had some success even against higher end defenses. Got 24 carries against Ohio State a couple weeks back. Didn't have as much success against Iowa as most don't, but has seen 20 plus carries 4 times already this season. So if you want a volume running back that is going to battering ram his way, hopefully 100 yards and a touchdown, maybe we get that out of him. And at 4.9, that would be an incredible outcome out of a guy that's that cheap. So that's a potential look, but again, not trying to force that. Team that's chasing 3 scores probably is not going to be running the ball 25 times. And so the thought would then be the passing game, but there is just nothing. There's no efficiency. There's no volume to this passing game. Rutgers has kind of adopted that same Big Ten philosophy of we're going to stop you on defense and maybe score some points on accident. And so I'm, outside of a high volume running back, I'm not wanting a whole lot of pieces of the Rutgers side. So sticking to kind of some alternate pieces of the Penn State pass catchers, but not a whole lot else in this one. And, 41 point total and a 3 touchdown spread. I think we can probably move on to other games here.
Yeah, it's not a great start by any means. So next one, we're going to talk about Michigan versus Maryland. Trying to do my best without, a Michigan expert on the show tonight. 19-point favorites, 50 total. Michigan had to throw the ball 8 times last week, and that was it was pretty disappointing for me because not that I have some sort of allegiance to Penn State, but I did think that they were going to be so much different this year. I thought the offense was going to be more dynamic with the stud quarterback coming into his own. I thought they'd give Michigan a game. Technically, they did by the score, but it just, man, it was that whole game was pretty disappointing to me. So Roman Wilson, 0 targets for the first time all year. That was pretty rough. I'll basically make this one quick, I think, at least on the Maryland side. I have no interest in any of the Maryland guys. Even when Maryland has a matchup that's worth talking about, I still find myself not caring one lick about anyone on this roster. And this is the 3rd straight year they've come into it with the receiver room where it's like, yeah, there's some damn good talent on this receiver room. They're going to be interesting, and they haven't put it together. They're poorly coached at every facet of the game. All of their guys are super cheap. They have upside. Like Caden Prather's a talented kid. He should be doing well. He's had some pretty solid games at times, but we can never trust anyone on this team, especially not going up against a defense like Michigan's, where they're just probably going to have a very difficult time scoring. So that leads us to the Michigan side, where I'm not paying 9-1 for J.J. McCarthy ever. Especially if there's even a remote chance of him throwing 8 passes in a game. Like, holy shit, we hardly ever see that. Even in I think the Air Force quarterback might throw more than 8 times a game. That's like scary stuff for me. So I'm not paying that price. The receivers, like Romans, he's priced out now because of the touchdown machine. The only one I ever really like is the tight end Colston Loveland, because he is the only show in town when it comes to tight ends. But at 4.8, he's kind of priced where he probably should be at this point. So that leads us to the running backs, where we're either paying up for Blake Corum to score twice and possibly go over 100, which he did last week. Major volume, 30 fantasy points, 145 yards on 26 carries, did his customary score multiple times. Typically in these type of games, we're going to see him rush, 10 to 15 times, probably get 75 yards and score twice. So that's kind of what I'm expecting from him. And at 8.4, I don't know. That's a lot of opportunity cost for me. Even hitting 30 at that 8.4, I think we can kind of get there for some of these, sub 7.5 options that are available to us in the slate. So there's just an opportunity cost, although there is safety involved there. If you've been whiffing at running back the past few weeks and you want a guy that is going to at least get some points, you could play Corum. But I feel like we're heating up with the running back calls here the last few weeks. So I think we can do a little bit better there than 8.4. I do feel like Donovan Edwards comes back into my life. I was obviously expecting a much bigger year than him rushing for just under 300 yards in 10 games, 3 touchdowns total. He does have 24 receptions for 230 yards, so he's getting it going there. But very, very disappointed in the year that he's had. He's kept his price down. He did have 10 carries last week, He's actually scored a touchdown in 2 straight. They didn't throw the ball much last week, so no receptions. But before that, he's had at least 3 receptions in 3 of his last 4 games. So he's getting that work there, and that's kind of padding his stats a little bit. And at 4.9, he's definitely a usable option, and especially if he has the touchdown equity there, which he has lately, 3 touchdowns in his past 4 games. It makes a lot of sense to at least consider him, because at 4.9, he can coast into a 15, 16, type score, and you can feel pretty decent about that. We obviously want some more, and he's probably going to need that PPR work to really push him over the top. But this Maryland team, I kind of feel like they're just dead, and I think Edwards and Quorum are just going to kind of trample them a little bit. So there is upside here for Edwards, and I think last week showed that, hey, this kid still has ability. They're just not using him like you would be accustomed to. That first game of the year, I don't know, it's just like he was totally broken, and he hasn't got going since. But last week was the first game I thought there was a glimmer of hope that maybe we could end the season on a high note with a couple of banger Donovan Edwards games at sub 5K, sub 10% ownership kind of thing. So Edwards is the one I come out of this game feeling like, yeah, I could definitely use him. But as far as the passing game goes on either of these teams, it's a big, fat no. All right, let's move on. Next game here, Utah versus Arizona. We got Pac-12 games here. I gave you 3 of them. We're going to start with the Utah-Arizona. This one is a 1-point favorite for Arizona. Did not think that at any point Arizona would be a favorite over Utah coming into the season. Total of 46. Arizona has been stout. Utah has been stout. Feel like this one might struggle to be 50, but on each side, there are some fantasy options. So break this one down for us.
Yeah, man. So a little bit of a disappointment, I think, for Arizona, I guess mainly on the defensive side against Colorado. Like, I kind of expected Arizona to run away with that one a little bit more than they did. And they let Colorado get some momentum going on offense and string out some drives and keep the Arizona offense off the field. And then Cowing got hurt, so limited the Arizona offense a little bit. And if you had some Cowing exposure, that was frustrating because we were expecting a big game out of him. But massive game out of McMillan, and he got not that he had to leave the game, but he got hit pretty hard a few times too. But tough kid. Little bit less than we would have hoped for from Fafita playing Colorado. I know he was a very popular option. We talked about him a good amount last week, and part of that was they handed the ball off to like the backup running back anytime they got anywhere near the end zone, and so we had some Williams touchdowns that were not real helpful if you were doing the Fafita and Coleman and McMillan or Cowing, 3-man stack for Arizona. So getting the backup running back touchdowns, like the one thing that you didn't want to happen. And there's good old DJ Williams coming in there for 933, but 2 scores. So I don't think that they're going to necessarily have that same efficiency on the ground against Utah. I do think they'll have to air it out a little bit more. I have some interest in Fafita. I'm not feeling as great about him. Playing Utah is a little bit different than playing Colorado, and yes, there will be more volume, but there will probably also be less efficiency. 6.8 is still a pretty good price though, and so I'm hedging. I'm not sold on it. I'm not all in like I was last week, but even when you're all in, sometimes it doesn't work out like we saw. In the running back room, we saw some amazing runs from Jonah Coleman. The stat line is pretty ridiculous. 11 carries for 179 yards and no touchdowns. It's pretty tough to do. To average like 17 yards a carry or whatever that is and not score a touchdown somehow. So he still put up a great game for that 4.3 price tag that he was on. I don't necessarily expect that kind of efficiency from him either against Utah. He's only up at 5. So we've got, a few different running backs, the Rutgers kid and Edwards from Michigan and Jaquindon Jackson in this same game is only 5'4". So in this kind of low fives, high fours price range, there are some decisions to be made. I do have interest in Jonah Coleman. I'm not forcing that. And then in the passing game, definitely dependent on the health of Cowing. It does seem like we're going to get him available. But definitely, keep an eye on that leading up to kickoff. It is a later start. It's 11:30 Pacific, 2:30 Eastern. So, you're probably not going to necessarily know by the time the big noon kickoffs start, but have some optionality there. Good news is McMillan is 6,800, so pretty easy to toggle between those two. If Cowing is out for some reason, or can't get through that injury, McMillan he's a good play anyway, but he's a fantastic play because he just saw all kinds of volume, especially once Cowing was out against Colorado, and he ended up 9-107 and 1. But he was also targeted. I don't have the number up, but just from having watched the game, he had to have been targeted like 13 or 14 times, generated a few PIs, that kind of thing. He's very, very much who Fafita was looking to whenever he needed anything. On the Utah side, it pains me to consider Bryson Barnes at 7-2, but I think I have to do it. Should Dewar look pretty good against the Arizona defense, and it has been a stouter group than we're used to, but I don't know, man. I think there's a case to be made for this being kind of a back and forth game and putting up a lot of points, and generally that would mean like you want exposure to the Arizona passing game and Utah running game, but Bryson Barnes has kind of put up some stats, and 7-2 is not a ton to pay. They haven't needed him to do a ton, but the few times that they've been in competitive games lately, he put up a decent amount against your Huskies and blew out Arizona State, but made some noise while doing it, and put up 32 fantasy points against USC, which we all know is not the best defense in the world. And so I'm not by any means going to make him my play of the week, but I'm at least willing to consider Bryson Barnes in a way that I'm not willing to consider Hudson Card. So let's leave it at that and say that, we're going to be open-minded about things. So what I'm really interested in is Jaquindon Jackson, and they haven't needed him to do anything for like 3 weeks. Just no volume. They were, they're blew out Arizona State and got blown out by Oregon, and both of those led to him not having a lot of touches. And then he was, involved and productive against both Arizona State and Washington, but just didn't have the same kind of heavy volume that he did against USC and Cal. And I see this game flow being a lot more like those two games, competitive kind of throughout, and them being them wanting to control the game via the ground game. And so if you're going to avoid using Bryson Barnes, which has been a popular thing to do this season, Jaquindon Jackson at 5'4", potentially getting 20 plus carries against an Arizona defense that Colorado was able to move the ball on is pretty interesting. And I think there's a pretty significant offensive line versus defensive line advantage for Utah while they're on offense. And so Jackson will be the beneficiary of that. They also have not been doing a ton with Vaki. I'm not sure why. He was amazing when they were giving him volume. And yes, that was due to injury, and that was always going to, change once healthy, but he got 1 carry last week. So I don't know that automatically means Jaquindon Jackson is going to get 25 carries this game, but certainly seems like there's more opportunity for that to be possible. Whereas, previously Vaki was getting, 10, 15 carries, that kind of thing. Then the Utah passing game. Utah just likes to throw to a bunch of tight ends you've never heard of. So if you have a strong feeling about like Vele for some reason, I will say he has shown up the last couple weeks, but that's not something that you can necessarily count on in terms of either the volume or the efficiency. Did have seven catches 2 weeks in a row and then 5 catches against Washington. So if there is a guy to use, it's probably him. And at 5-1, you are getting a decent price for that volume. But I feel like the offense probably goes through the ground game in this one. But if you're going to do that crazy Bryson Barnes thing and you want to pair him with someone, I would say pair him with Belly. So if you did that with like a McMillan run back, that would be a decent way to get a lot of exposure to this game with the way I think the game flow is going to go. But yeah, this will be a good one. I definitely want some exposure one way or another to this game, despite what I think is a fairly low total. And you might have mentioned wanting to go over on this one. I think I'm with you on that.
Yeah. And there, speaking of Vaki, they seem to be using him as like an H-back tight end. Like that's what they did against the Huskies, at least. And he actually scored a receiving touchdown that way, but so hard to burn a valuable running back spot on a guy who might play tight end. It's like if he was listed as a receiver, I'd be like, I might pay 5.3 Vaki, but yeah. I don't think I can do that as a running back, but yeah, I like the Jackson call for sure. That's something to investigate a little bit more. It does seem like Arizona's hell bent on using DJ Williams as their red zone back, which just robs Coleman of that upside and touchdown equity, which is tough, but he's still pretty cheap, like you mentioned. So something to think about the Barnes play for GPPs for sure. I hadn't really considered him, but you made a good case for it, so I'll check it out more. All right, next game, Appy State versus James Madison. I love that we're getting James Madison on these main slates a lot. I know they kind of let us down last time, but I'm going right back. 8.5-point favorites. The total's 56. Starting with the Appy State side, they have a quarterback in Joey Aguilar, 7'5", who I think most people would just kind of maybe glance over and say, nah, that's not against JMU. But JMU's pass defense is pretty trash, and we're not usually maybe thinking of Appy State as a pass-heavy team. Over the years, they've had some really good running backs, right, that just light it up, Noel included. But Aguilar does kind of project to do well here, and I think they're going to end up having to throw 30, 35 times, if not more, here to kind of keep up with this JMU offense. And it's within 8 to 10 points projected for Vegas, so we're looking at a relatively close game. Nice thing about Aguilar as well is that he's got a little bit of rushing upside. He's not talking like Jaden Daniels rushing for 150 yards, but 25 to 50 yards. He could score a touchdown there, kind of push that 7.5 price point and that upside even further. We saw, back in week 9 against USM, he threw for almost 404. Against Marshall, 250-3, 250-3 against Georgia State. So he's been pretty steady. And I honestly feel like people are going to look at Appy State and just have that reputation of, man, like they're a running team. But I think Aguilar is somebody that we really should consider for our main lineups. Maybe it comes down to like, am I going for running backs again? If not, I think he's right up there for me as one of the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks. And that might be a hot take. I'm not sure how ownership's going to shake out just yet. But like I said, just reputation-wise, I think people will maybe be a little bit leery of that one. So I'm looking at him heavily. Nate Noel's there at 6'5". Like I said, typically on this Mountaineers team, you can count on the running game, but he's not getting like the 35 carries that we're used to seeing for a RB1. And it is because they're playing, so many different running backs that are getting multiple carries. Kanye Roberts has sort of emerged a few weeks back. Now he's almost splitting there with Noel, so it makes it really hard. Roberts is only 4.3, and I think there's merit to using him in GPPs. But where JMU's strength is with the running defense and not with the pass defense. So I'm more on the passing game there. There are a myriad of options on this App State team. Their target leader is Caden Robinson. He has 55 targets, 41 catches, 540 yards, 6 touchdowns. Christian Horn, 41 targets, 27 catches, 450 and 5. Deshaun Davis, 40 targets, 24 catches, 314 yards, and 3 touchdowns there as well. So those have been the top 3 for most of the season. Christian Horn has not been quite as good. He's been banged up, and he is probable. But his last game in week 9, he was the WR1 all the way. But he has been suffering with multiple issues throughout the season, which has kind of robbed him of some of the explosiveness we might be used to seeing from him. It does sound like he's going to play, though. I am kind of on the fence with him playing. Like, I don't want anyone to miss, but I really want to use Caden Robinson down there at 4.9. I think he's fine either way. And you're going to look at his volume and be like, well, he's not really doing all that much, but he just seems like the guy that's going to just snake a touchdown or two and have that big explosive play against JMU where he's just going to, make his value in like 2 to 3 plays very, very easily. And he's been really good 3 out of the last 4, seeing that heavy volume, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that Horn's been banged up. So he is my favorite receiver in this App State receiver room at this moment. Caden Robinson at 4.9 and Aguilar at 7.5. It makes a lot of sense. You don't have to pay too much for that pairing whatsoever. Now, when JMU was on the slate last time, we were all over these underpriced receivers, right? And Reggie Brown did just nothing. Followed that up with a 44 against UConn. 9 catches for 202 yards and 2 touchdowns. So yes, that was UConn, but Jesus, where was that game when we all had him? And then same thing with Elijah Surratt. He was fine in that Georgia Tech game, but then he goes for 13, 160 for 32 fantasy points against UConn. So both of those guys had big games. It's at least made their prices somewhat higher. Remember when they came on the slate, they were both, 4.8 and 5K. They're still not like cheap enough to push me off. And I still think we'll see maybe not as significant amount of ownership as we had seen the last time they were on the slate, but we're still going to see probably 35 to 40 on both of those guys. And I'm kind of right back in the same situation where I just want to plug both of those guys in. Maybe it's a better decision to play one just in case there is an underperformance and we're not getting, shooting ourselves in the foot upside wise. But then it gets to a situation like, which one can I actually take? Like, true, Reggie Brown's the WR1. He's the number 1 guy, but what's the chances that he, gets 10 and Surratt goes for 30? Like, they're basically the same. So it's really hard to pick just one for me. So if it's a situation where you can't play both and people ask me this week who to play, I'm just going to tell you to flip a coin or play the one you like most. I'm kind of considering both. And obviously that means the kind of breakout stud this year, Jordan McLeod at 8.3 has to be in consideration. He was great in that Georgia State game. He was also very chalky, we know, but he ended up just running all over them, 104 yards and 2 touchdowns. He still threw for 300 yards and 4 touchdowns as well. It just happened to be other guys. So he's phenomenal. Got to be considered one of the top quarterbacks, for me at least, on the slate. And I don't know that he will get the ownership he probably deserves because there are, Drake Mays on the slate. There's obviously USC and UCLA. There's your guy from Georgia against that Tennessee group, Oklahoma State game. Like, there's a lot of different Bo Nix is on the slate. So I think we're going to get McLeod for relatively lower ownership than we saw on the slate last time because he was just so far and away the best play on that slate 2 weeks ago. And this one, there are at least, 5, 6, 7 guys that I could envision playing as your QB1. So I'm still back on McLeod and one of his receivers for sure. I am seeing a lot of talk about using the running game for JMU because App State's, rush defense can be exploited as well. You basically have 2 guys there getting that volume. Tyson Lawton, who's sitting there at 4.6. He had a big game, 18 carries for 95 yards, also caught 6 passes for 57 yards and a touchdown back in week 10. Followed that up with only 8 carries last week against UConn, but he did have 3 receptions as well. So he's still pretty active. And then you have Kalen Black, who on paper is usually the RB1, but he's lost that volume the last 2 weeks to Lawton. So it looks like he's been usurped slightly by Lawton. He's still getting, basically 5 to 7, touches, targets, that kind of thing, but he's just not in play at 5.5. I am seeing quite a bit of people kind of leaning on Lawton because you do get that discount at 4.6. You'd mentioned there's already like 2 or 3 different options at running back sub 5K. You can throw another one in there, and he does look like he's going to potentially be relatively popular. Latrell Palmer, who also gets carries in this backfield, did not play. He's dealing with some kind of turf toe issue or something. Him playing is not a big deal, but he does take 3 to 5 touches away from those guys, and it kind of just becomes a cluster. So if Lawton becomes chalk, I'm actually okay getting away from that play, and I'd rather just play McLeod at at 15 to 20% and potentially both receivers. Maybe that's more of a GPP move, so I'll have to decide which one, but I don't think you can go wrong with either. This game makes a lot of sense in terms of game stack too, because you can easily run it back with with Aguilar at 7.5. That's not breaking the bank, and Caden Robinson. Potentially play 4, maybe 5 guys from this game, and if it shoots out like it has the potential to do, you'd be sitting, atop all the GPPs, reminiscent of the Miami Texas A&M game, which just sticks in my mind eternally for this season. So I'm a big fan of this one. I think it should be heavily owned. It won't be like it was in week 10 though, and I think that's an advantage for us. This is actually one of the first games on the slate that isn't gross for DFS. So before we move on, do you want to add any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I love pretty much every part of the James Madison passing game. Don't need to reiterate all that, but the kind of volume that McLeod is able to support for both of those receivers is pretty astounding. And we don't really get a lot of that. Like, what other team has 2 pass catchers that are each catching double digits in a single game? Like, that's just wild. So I want every piece of that I can get.
Definitely. All right, now we're going to move on to UCLA, USC. 6.5 point favorites are the Trojans. We all, of course, have a total of 65.5. That could, approach 70 with the way that USC's defense plays. It is going to be an interesting one because it's challenging us. We know usually we can take whatever quarterback and studs against USC, but UCLA's quarterback situation is kind of, for lack of a better term, nasty. And I'm not quite sure how we can attack USC. So I'm looking forward to hearing what take you have on the Bruins, because this one seems a little tougher than normal USC games are.
Yeah. So, Colin Schlee was the guy that was taking snaps under center against Arizona State. Didn't do very well, ended up getting hurt. And so now it's going to be Ethan Garber's under center against USC. And there probably is a less exciting quarterback that you could throw against the USC defense in like the entirety of college football. But I think Ethan Garber's in the top 5 of not exciting quarterbacks to use. And he's at 6'4". So like, yeah, you're getting a really good price on the quarterback that's going to be playing this terrible USC defense. But there's some weird stuff going on at UCLA, man. Chip Kelly's apparently getting fired, and I don't know if that means that they're going to like say, yeah, Ethan Garber's going to be the starter, but now Dante Moore's healthy too. So we're going to put him in the second quarter and, let's see what he can do. And maybe he's the future of the program. That's just all kinds of frustrating, because you want to use almost any 6'4" quarterback against the USC defense, except for he's not very good to begin with. And he also might not play the whole game. Like, that's a scenario you probably don't. So then you say, okay, well, I can't use a quarterback. Maybe I want to attack the running game. Well, Carson Steele volume is way down, and they brought him in to be the guy. Mac guy coming to the Pac-12 and had a lot of success early on in the season, was getting 20, 30 carries, against some not as good opponents in Washington State and Stanford. And Oregon State, he still managed to get a lot of volume, and you would think that he would have smashed in like a Colorado matchup, but then they're like, hey, we're going to kind of ease off of that, and they gave him 11 carries in what was still a fairly competitive game. And so they've been going to Harden a little bit, and so you go, okay, well, maybe I can go get a discount on Harden. We can use him. Well, he's only getting like 7 to 10 carries, and he's not like 3.5. He's 4,900, and you could have Donovan Edwards for that price. So it's just comedy of errors with this UCLA team, in terms of, yes, they in theory should be able to exploit every part of the UCLA defense, but they can't make up their mind on who they're going to do it with, and that's going to make it tough to have some continuity and consolidation of fantasy points for UCLA. The one guy I do have a little bit of confidence in that's been consistent throughout the season and comes at a decent price is Logan Loya. At 4.5, he only costs you a receiver spot, has no fewer than 3 catches in all but one of their games this season. Is a pretty explosive guy, up over 12 yards a catch, been in the end zone 4 times, and seems to produce regardless of which awful quarterback UCLA throws out there. So at 4.5, I mean that's a pretty good record of consistency, and I would imagine he's only going to be even more efficient against UCLA, or I'm sorry, against USC, against that defense. You can also look to Sturdivant, who's flashed a time or two, and he's all the way down at 3.9. I think if you would have said at the beginning of the season you'd get J. Michael Sturdivant at 3.9 in the game against USC, you'd probably be like, oh, well, lock button. That's easy. But it hasn't really turned out that way. He hasn't been seeing that kind of volume. And then after those two, it's a little bit rough. Cam Brown, if he's healthy, if we get confirmation he's healthy, I mean, he's down there at 3.4. It's kind of interesting, but I think I'm going to stick to Logan Loya. On the USC side, let's stick on receivers and kind of do it backwards. This is somewhat of an anomaly of wide receiver pricing. You go into a game and you see where the receiver pricing is on each team. There are 6 USC receivers priced above the most expensive UCLA receiver in a game with a 65 total. That's wild. That tells you everything about those two programs. And, we're as far into the year as we are, mid-November, and we still haven't really figured out this USC receiver room because they haven't really figured out the USC receiver room. Brendan Rice is probably the guy I want the most of. He's not the most expensive guy. That'd be Taj Washington. And we do get, probably a little bit higher upside with Taj, but we get a little bit more consistency with Brendan Rice. And 11 touchdowns on the season, probably has a chance to add to that here. Taj only 6, only seen the end zone 6 times. Mario Williams hasn't really been the guy that we wanted to see him be. Dorian Singer has very much not been the guy that we wanted to see him be, and probably the most disappointing guy, not in terms of how he's produced when he's been on the field, but how much they've let him be on the field, Zachariah Branch. And he's at 5.5, and he has the talent to put up Pitt Jordan Addison type numbers or USC Jordan Addison type numbers with the explosiveness and talent that he has. They just, for whatever reason, don't want to scheme him into being able to do that or let him run free as a wide receiver. He's kind of been a gadget decoy type guy. And I get it, a lot of speed, a lot of gravity, but I think they also want to work him in. They should want to work him into the productivity of the offense as well. But Brendan Rice is probably the guy I'm going to plant my flag on from that position group. But you can do well with any of those receivers on any given day. Marshawn Lloyd was back healthy for the Oregon game. Didn't really matter. They were chasing points most of that game, and so not really pounding Marshawn Lloyd a whole lot. Could see a little bit more of him in this one, but rarely is he going to get the kind of volume that we would want to see out of a workhorse back. Probably you'll still see 10 to 12 carries against a pretty tough UCLA run defense. May see some involvement in the passing game. Does have 10 catches on the season, so not something he does a ton of, but he's always capable of breaking one if he does find some ground in the open field. And then Caleb Williams, man, there's a lot of conversation this week. Might Caleb Williams come back for another season? Is that NIL money that much sweeter than being drafted to the Bears or the Giants or whoever Caleb Williams would end up going to? I don't know what Caleb Williams is doing, man. It's such a tough situation that he's in. At 11K, there's just other quarterbacks I want to get to, and I would love to play him in this game. I would love to see him, have some success that's been elusive for a few weeks now. He's had good games, but he hasn't had the elite upside games that he showed last season and then kind of earlier on this season against the Colorados and Arizona States of the world. He hasn't had that game recently, and so for 11K, you need like 40 to 45 points to be kind of the floor, and that's not really his floor. That's closer to his ceiling. That's not a floor for most people. So the talent's definitely there, and obviously, the explosiveness, but I'm probably going to shy away from using Caleb in main lineups, and going to look to get exposure via, different pass catchers sprinkled into different lineups. But as far as using Caleb himself, I'm probably not getting there unless a ton of value just opens up. And I'm like, yeah, I could pay, mid 8s for McLeod, or, high 9s for Dylan Gabriel. But all of a sudden I have this other salary I don't know what to do with. And maybe I get there that way, but I think I'm going to end up with less Caleb than I would like to otherwise. Fan player, but tough to see him maximize that ceiling in this one.
Yeah, man, and you hit it. There's just been so much disappointment for both receiving groups, man, and not even like USC. We knew, like, coming into the season way back, you remember the week 0 slate, it was like, man, how could we possibly take any of these USC guys without knowing the pecking order? Remember, Dorian Singer was like 60% on that first slate, and it was like, he ended up doing, like, that was his best game of the year, go figure, but he hasn't been playable since, and they just refuse to feel like they're scared to, like, pricing these guys too cheap. Because I'd probably take a shot on Singer if he was like 4.3, right? Like, who wouldn't? But at 5.4, it's still kind of tough. And I really like the Deuce Robinson kid. He's probably a year away from being viable. It's just crazy. I did look up while you were talking there. Caleb Williams has the 5th highest NIL valuation in all of college sports. Not just college football, but all of college sports. 2.7 million. He's crazy. So I mean, yeah, you get a signing bonus for that in the NFL, but then you go like to the Jets or something, or I don't know, crappy football team, and you end up getting sacked a million times, and then they're like, he's a bust. So I don't blame him, honestly, with the way NIL is. Shoot, why not come back and be the big man on campus again? Yeah, there's injury risk, of course, but shit, if you're making $3 million in college football, it sounds a lot better than playing for the Bears and being on your back all game. Most definitely. Other disappointment in J. Michael Sturdivant, man. Like, shit, I thought for sure he would be great. He's 3.9. They kind of try to bait me into playing him. Like, I'm considering that, but the quarterback situation for the Bruins is so damn awful. I don't even know if we can do that. So, good term on the breakdown on that one. It's a tough one for me because usually it's lock and load, and I don't even know if I can get anywhere in that game. All right, next one here: UNC versus Clemson. The North Carolina Tar Heels have been a fun team all season long. Clemson's 7.5-point favorite. It's a 59 total, which is somewhat high for a Clemson game. Starting on the North Carolina side, all of the relevant players are extremely expensive, as you would expect. Drake May is almost 10K, and as fantastic as he's been, and he is a dual threat, he just hasn't shown it as much this year, at least recently. That's a really tough price against that Clemson defense. I'm almost scarred from the early season shutdown of Garrett Schrader and Syracuse that Clemson threw on me, that I really have a hard time taking anyone against them right now, especially somebody sitting there at 10K. And I do think that May will pass a ton in this game, so he'll still get 40 plus attempts. And if he goes for 3 or 4 touchdowns, he still might pay this price off, but there's so much risk involved with it that I think he's better suited for GPPs right now, and I don't think I can play him in the May. I do see the Omarion Hampton play, which has been very good to us. North Carolina hasn't been on a lot of main slates this year, I feel like. Most of those secondary late night slates. He's been really good. 31 carries against Duke. Duke was a defense that could have potentially contained him, and he just completely slapped them around. So this will be a great test against Clemson because looking through it, this is definitely going to be the toughest matchup he's had. And you look back at who they played, like Miami, a tougher defense. He had 197 rushing yards on them. No problem. Duke, a tougher defense on paper, 170 yards against them, no problem. And he's just shredded, the Minnesotas of the world, or the Pittsburghs of the world, the South Carolinas, the easier opponents. This will definitely be a good test. And I'm kind of on the fence if I want to pay this 7-3 for him, because I certainly want exposure to the Tar Heels, but they're just taxing us out a little bit. So as of now, I'm not on Hampton, but I do see the first and second round of ownership projections showing a hefty number on Hampton. And I think people are just looking at the box scores there and saying, auto plug this guy in. And we could see an Ollie Gordon-like situation there on Hampton. At wide receiver, Tez Walker is amazing. Target machine, one of the best receivers. 8-1. I have a really big hang up about paying for expensive receivers, no matter how good they are. Even in good matchups, right? So in a tough matchup, that's kind of a no for me. I think if anything, you wanted to use a receiver from the Carolina room, it'd be Bryson Nesbitt, who did go up 900 to 5K from 4-1 after another solid performance. He scored double-digit fantasy points in 4 straight games. Still in play there at 5K, but maybe I'm respecting this Clemson defense just a little bit too much. Speaking of Clemson, I think that as much as you and I are both kind of on the same page with like Never Klubnik, maybe more me than you. But at 7-3, I think he's got to be in consideration here. I do think Clemson would end up just leaning on their running game anyways, but the way that he dressed down Georgia Tech at least showed us like, hey, that this kid is talented, as much shit as we give him. 4 touchdown passes. He only threw for 205 yards, but he was super efficient with those 34 attempts. 25 fantasy points, pretty good for him. 7-3 is at least a price point that we can realistically get to. When he's 8K or higher, that's not a realistic price point, but he's definitely a guy going up against this North Carolina defense that, does give up some yardage. He's got to be in consideration. I think the running game is more appealing because, especially with Shipley, we know he's going to get passing work. Both of them are super cheap. Film off at 5.7. Will Shipley at 5'9". Shipley now healthy for the most part. Looking at the snaps from last week, they both played almost identical. It was like 46% to 43%. So we're probably going to have a timeshare here. So maybe gone, at least for right now, are the days of Shipley getting 25 plus touches. At 5'9", though, he can definitely still beat that price point. I'm thinking like 3 to 5 receptions, a touchdown or 2, and can still, 10, 12 carries. He can still pay off this 5'9" price. I feel like because of the recent production of Maffa that he will be higher owned than Shipley, which might be interesting for some to hear about, but he has been really good the last 3 games. His touches have gone up. Obviously the Notre Dame game, which I still can't believe, that they were going to give him 40 touches like that. And 17 for 96 against Georgia Tech, had a reception. Shipley's going to be more the reception guy, which gives him that PPR work. But I think the volume that's been going Phil's way is going to make him a little bit higher owned. So I think we get leverage with Shipley and we get more passing upside with him as well. But I will probably never say like I'm fading 100% Phil Maffa because, that was the biggest like misstep I've had this season by far. And I certainly will want to have exposure one way or another. But I think one of those two between Shipley and Maffa will end up in my main lineup at those prices in this matchup against North Carolina. The receiver room, there's really 2 guys that I like. Antonio Williams just, can't seem to get healthy for any length of time. Bo Collins is sitting there as the most consistent guy at 5'1", and he's fine. But really, there's 2 guys that I would have interest in playing. One being the youngster Tyler Brown, who sits there at 4'9". Kind of had a few weeks struggle there. You shouted him out last week, I believe, and he went for 741 and a touchdown. Very good game for him at 4'9". Targets wise, he's was solid, had 7, caught all 7 of those, led the team, actually tied with 7 with my guy Jake Brenningstool, the tight end. Brenningstool also caught a touchdown last week, 4 catches on 7 targets for 27 yards. So those are both the guys that I'd be looking at. And Brenningstool, we get him down there at 4K. So that's our specialty, really, the cheap tight ends, cash plays that yeah, maybe we're looking at the old boring 5 for 50, but he does have touchdown equity, and he is playing a North Carolina team that is very, very average when it comes to their secondary. So I like Brenning Stool at 4K. I think he gives us a lot of salary savings, so we can actually spend up on a premier running back if we want to, or if you want to spend up for a receiver, you can. But that 4K price just really draws me in. And I know it's just 900 more for Brown, and he's probably got more upside, but he also has more downside as he could easily, put up a 1 for 10 and nothing else. But this is the matchup for Brown to continue and show a little bit of that upside and potentially, even be a slate breaker one of these times. He strikes me as a guy in a bowl game that's just going to go for like 200 receiving yards. Definitely keep an eye on him. But Brenning Stool, Brown, and then one of Maffa and Shipley. So I'm probably coming away from Clemson this week with 2 players in my lineup. Never feels good for me lately, but this is just a great spot that I think Clemson's going to be able to pay off these meager prices. Had they come in at like 7K and 7.5 for Shipley, I don't think I'd bat an eye. I'd probably just walk away, but this is way too cheap for me not to have pretty heavy exposure across the board in all formats. Before we move on, do you have a lean? I got to get your take there because I feel like there's going to be a big thing this week. Shipley or Maffa, or Shipley. Like, do you have a lean between those two, or are you kind of using them both as well in different lineups?
Yeah, I think it's you never want to, like, as a trying to give edge and information, you never want to hedge and be like, oh well, you just use both, but like really just use both. There's equal upside to both, and there's a lot more ways to be wrong if you only use one of them. So I do think that they both have merit, and they're both accurately priced, so it's not like we're getting a massive discount on either.
Yeah, and variance tends to rear its ugly head with college football, so it's nice to have that protection of popping one in another lineup just in case. All right, next one, we have another Pac-12 game here. Oregon versus ASU. 23.5 point favorites are the Ducks, 54 total. ASU is kind of a weird one. They get the doors blown off, and then they play my Huskies super tough. So it's tough to say what version will show up, but either way, Oregon has to be a very, very appealing option this week for us. Go ahead and let us know about this one.
Yeah, man, I think the version of ASU that's going to show up this week is the one that gets their doors blown off by Oregon. The Oregon offense is just too good, and yeah, I agree. Like, so is the Washington offense, and I'm still trying to figure out what happened in that game. But Bo Nix, like, and it's so weird to say, but Bo Nix is just like operating at such a high level in this offense, and like really didn't have to do that much against USC. It was Bo Nix making like some extremely efficient plays, and then Bucky Irving just like slamming the door at the end of everything. Like it's hard to say Bo Nix didn't have like a good game when he threw for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns, but like he could have had 8 touchdowns if he needed to. Like he was just, they were clicking on all cylinders. You'd hit like an 80-yard pass every other drive, it would seem like. And so, he didn't have to do a lot, but hit the wide open guy that ran for a really long touchdown. I see a lot of that happening again. I see Bucky Irving being pretty involved again. Yeah, if you can afford them, every piece of this Oregon offense is good. That said, Bo Nix at 10.8, it's a pretty big ask. Right there with Caleb, like you kind of need him to have that crazy Dylan Gabriel game where he just keeps the foot on the gas the whole time for, no reason at all, even when they're up by 30 points. And I think there's a good chance they will be up by 30 points. So the thing that would scare me off of Bo a little bit is that he's really only done that once in the Cal game. And, they were up by a ton, and he kind of kept going, and it was a little bit that he scored a lot of it early and had 2 rushing touchdowns. But in other blowouts, they kind of have taken the foot off the gas and just handed over to Bucky. And so if there's anything that has me a little bit indecisive about Bo, it's that, they have a good shot at being up by 30 points in the second quarter and not really needing him to do a whole lot. If you are going to be on him, it's hard for me to say this, but I don't think Troy Franklin's the play. Troy Franklin is definitely an extremely talented receiver. He just has been giving so much more volume to Tez Johnson as of late. And everybody knows the story with, they're adopted brothers, and, he's got that same common kind of chemistry that you look for in a wide receiver quarterback combo across the board. But the last 2 weeks has been just unreal volume to Tez Johnson. And how do you beat that? I mean, he's got, six or more catches in each of the last 5 weeks, over 100 yards in the last 2, multiple touchdowns in the last 2. And he's sitting there at 7.3 instead of Troy Franklin at 8.7. Troy Franklin's probably more talented, but if he's throwing it to Tez more, I think I'm probably more likely to roll with Tez. So, not telling you to not use Troy Franklin because he has any ability to go off at any given time, but like you need a Marvin Harrison Jr. type of game out of Troy Franklin, whereas you don't quite need that out of Tez at that price point. And so I'm probably leaning more towards Tez if using Bo Nix, and if not using Bo Nix, you can still sprinkle Tez, but if you're not using Bo Nix, you're probably using Bucky Irving. But one way or another, yeah, Oregon's going to score some points. You're going to want some exposure to this game. Gary Bryant's been non-existent in the passing game. Trayshawn Holden has been more existent, but still not seeing the kind of volume that we want. And so I think probably just focused on Tez. On the Arizona State side, we've seen a lot of situations to use Cam Scatteraboo. They're probably in one of those situations. He's, the guy that they use when they can pound the rock and control the clock, and they love him. They give him all the volume that they can, but when they're down 30 points, they're not going to give him a lot of volume, and they're just not going to have the ball enough to give him a lot of volume. And so, even at 5.9, which is a very fair price most weeks for Cam Scatteraboo, I'm probably not headed there. I do have a lot of interest in Elijah Badger. Elijah Badger was like the only guy to catch passes last week. And, I don't know if that's a chemistry thing or a lack of talent. I mean, we saw Xavier Guillory, be successful earlier in the season. He's obviously out with an injury now, and they just have not really had another guy step up that can be trusted with a lot of receiving volume. And, Elijah Badger has just been that guy. So stat line last week against UCLA in a 17-7 game, so very low scoring game, Elijah Badger went 12-1, 16-1. What is he going to do against Oregon when they're chasing 30 points out of the gate? I think he's going to have an absolutely massive game. Maybe not super efficient, but it's not like Oregon has the world's toughest pass defense either, and he's just going to have all kinds of opportunity they're going to be throwing all day. So love Elijah Badger at 5.7, and definitely in games where you have any type of exposure to Oregon, I would heavily consider using Elijah Badger as a run back.
For sure. I really like the Ferguson at 4.2, just a cheap way to get exposure to Oregon here. And then I really thought Jordan James was going to do anything last week, but didn't really come to fruition. And sitting there at 5.5, I don't really get a great discount on him. So a little tough to get there. But another team that's just super highly priced. And I'm curious to see how ownership goes there, because I think people will try to jam these guys in, but find real quick that maybe they just can't. All right, next game we're going to talk about here, Wake Forest versus Notre Dame. Wake Forest 24.5 point favorites, total under 50, 46.5. Really makes it difficult to get too excited about the Wake Forest guys, and really it's been that way most of the season. Wake Forest just hasn't been the same team that they were with Sam Hartman at the helm, and ironically they're playing their old quarterback in this game. there are some DFS options throughout the season that have kind of panned out, but there's Jamal Banks at 6'8", like that's not going to happen. The running game is all a mishmash of options. So in the Notre Dame defense, I realize they got cooked by Maffa, but I do not see that happening here against this Wake Forest team at all. So it really just puts us on a decision if we want to play anyone from Notre Dame. And I think majority of people probably would not. But for me, I got to go back to my dude, Audric Estime. He really came through in a huge way late in that Pittsburgh game, scored all 3 of his touchdowns in, I believe, the fourth quarter, and paid off at like a sub 5% ownership. His price of $8K might be enough to give people pause. It's a really, really big spread. They've already shown in the past that even in blowouts, they'll keep running the ball and they'll let Audric do his thing like they did against Pittsburgh. He's just a really safe option. And I think with this value that we've been able to kind of delve through and point out like, hey, this is better value than we've had the last couple of weeks, at least at the receiver spots, we should be able to fit a player like Audric Estime in there quite easily. And I think he's kind of a flagship play for me there at 8K. Just as expensive enough to kind of keep people away, but maybe he'll still see like a pocket of 15 to 20%, but really hurt people that fade him. He is just 12 yards away from 1,000, so he's knocking on the door of that. He has 13 touchdowns this year. He catches a little bit, 17 receptions for 142 yards, but this is just such a great spot. Even against Clemson, where the game was super close, he couldn't really get a ton going on the ground. He still generated 22 fantasy points, and they utilized him a lot in the passing game in that one, so his receptions went up. So, it's really not a very good chance of it happening, but say Wake Forest were able to keep this close, at least we know Audric would get work in the passing game and in a likely blowout. They'll just push him, 20, 25 times on the ground, and he'll just rack up points and yardage. So I wouldn't be shocked to see him have like 120 at halftime in this one if things break the right way. So I'm really quite excited about him and feel like maybe people are going to overlook him like they've done all season long. So that's really my big take of this one. The Sam Hartman of Notre Dame is just not the same as Sam Hartman of Wake Forest. Because they're such a run-heavy team, he's not asked to throw the ball as much, and they've turned him into a game manager. And he's good at it. He's got 18 touchdowns to just 7 interceptions, over 2,200 yards. He has a couple rushing scores. Like he's just doing his thing and winning games, but he's just not a DFS option anymore. And early in the season, it's like, okay, Sam Hartman was doing his thing, 3 straight games over 23 fantasy points, but it hasn't had to happen for him, and I don't think it happens for him in this one. So really, it's just Estime. There are some cheap options in the receiver room. Tyree still flying around there. Jaden Thomas has had some pretty sizable games, but most of the part he's been pretty disappointing. But you can get any of these guys under 4K if that is something that tickles your fancy. With Mitchell Evans, their top tight end, out, Holden Stays has kind of stepped into a role where theoretically he should get more work. He's technically the most expensive there at 4 or 5. But he hasn't really had to step up into a big receiver role either. The one game against Clemson there where he would have needed to, he kind of disappeared and didn't show up. So I think it's Audric Estime or nobody from this game really, and just kind of sticking that 8K into my lineup. It's a tough price to pay, but I think we can make it happen here with the value that we have. All right, so we got 2 games left. These are actually pretty decent ones. It's a slate full of ugliness, honestly, but Georgia versus Tennessee, 10.5-point favorites is what I got on Georgia, which is interesting. I think they might be live to kind of smack the false round, and a total of 59.5. I know there's going to be a couple Georgia pieces that you're on here, so break this one down for us.
Yeah, man. So I guess first thing to note that kind of jumps off the page, we got Brock Bowers back. Holy cow. I didn't think we were going to see him back that quickly. Came back and, had not an elite Brock Bowers game by any means, but like he wasn't even supposed to be on the field yet. And we're sitting there seeing reports that he's like warming up. We're going, what? Brock Bowers playing? What's going on? So he's at 7.5. I don't know that we can necessarily get there. I don't know that he's fully healthy or that they are even going to push him to the point that, we are going to see a full workload from him to make him viable at 7.5. But we're going to see just enough of him to take enough targets away from the McConkeys and Lovitts and Rar Thomases of the world, but also draw attention away from them. So it's an interesting conundrum. I mean, everybody's priced up on Georgia except for Rar Thomas, who I can't get into. Dom Lovett's probably the best value at 5.3 in terms of the guys that are, going to see a good amount of volume in the offense. There's probably other receivers that I like better that are in that price point. So if you are very much into, a 9K Carson Beck, and also, using a piece of the passing game, it's probably going to be some advantageousness to using Lovett over Ladd McConkey, but those targets are going to be pretty spread out. I actually have a little bit more interest in the running game, and I'm typically a Dan Edwards guy. At 7.5, that's pretty expensive price point for a guy that is going to be splitting carries. And Kendall Milton just looked like a guy shot out of a cannon last week. Every time he touched the ball, it was extremely efficient. Ended up with 9, 127, and 2. Added a 12-yard catch to that. And he's been getting pretty consistent, 10-plus touches the last 3 weeks. And I think they're trying to split that workload a little bit more with him and with Edwards and not use Edwards quite as heavily. So trending in the right direction for Kendall Milton, extremely explosive against Ole Miss, was in there despite them having, a pretty big lead, and has kind of a nose for the end zone, and they also give him some passing work. So Kendall Milton at 5.8 is probably my best or the play I have the most interest in on the Georgia side, despite, my typical affectations for Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers being a deity that he is. I just think on a point per dollar basis, we're getting most bang for our buck with Kendall Milton. On the Tennessee side, pretty tough to go up against Georgia, although we did see, Ole Miss put up a reasonable game. And Judkins, made some headlines and did okay. But I don't think there's enough juice to the Tennessee running game. And I would love to see them give Jalen Wright the carries. I think we talked about that, last week or the week before, that I would love to see some Jalen Wright volume, but it's just not there. And at 5.4, there's other guys. We talked about half dozen guys in that price range that probably are more appealing than Jalen Wright at 5.4 going up against Georgia. We're not going to talk about Tennessee quarterbacks. It just upsets me. As far as Squirrel White and Ramel Keaton, that whole thing, it's a tough defense. They're also going to be chasing some points, so there's going to be a good amount of volume. But it comes back to poor quarterback play, and poor quarterback play gets worse against Georgia. So I think it's probably going to be Kendall Milton mainly that I'm interested in. I get if you want to use any of the receivers, I completely support that as well. Probably will have some exposure to the passing game as well, not quite as heavily as in past weeks, but definitely want, pieces of this Georgia offense strewn about lineups, most heavily concentrated within Kendall Milton, and then none of the Tennessee side, really.
Yeah, and the Vols just lost, not that he was doing much, but Dante Thornton's out for the year now, so it's just a few games left. Leaves them with even less options. Having Ramel Keaton at 4.5, man, that's just such a nice price for his talent, but we know he's probably gonna turn in a poor performance at no fault of his own. So I'm digging the Milton call. We had been, several times earlier in the year, we're like, when are they going to turn Milton loose? They're not really using him like we expected. He's not catching passes. He's not doing anything. And then, lately he's been turning it on. So I like that call. I think that's a little sneaky, especially since Schrader just undressed Tennessee like that. And obviously Schrader is a different animal, but this running game can definitely take off against the ball. So I like that quite a bit. Seems like we're heavy
just,
on the
just to specify in case somebody jumped in the middle of that clip, when we were talking about a Milton in this game, we were talking about Kendall. We are not talking about Joe.
Yeah, never Joe. Only Nico. Can't turn Nico loose in this game. Let Joe be on his ass in this game all along. It's farewell. Good call, though. All right, last game on the slate, Oklahoma State versus Houston. This will have some fantasy goodness. Some people maybe they're turned off of what happened with Oklahoma State. 6-point favorites, 59 total. The Oklahoma State side, we have to start with Ollie Gordon, who is 8.8K. It's a significant price drop or increase, and his streak of just nastiness ends against UCF. And I know that a lot of people will look at that and be like, well, hell no. But it would not surprise me to see him get back to 30 carries and just dominating against a Houston defense that's pretty trashy as well. UCF suddenly not a lockdown rush defense by any means. Oklahoma State they faltered. And there is a thing like, I don't know, with Bryson Allen or that time with Wisconsin, there are wearing down kids. They're kids, but you give a guy like 30 plus carries each and every game for 11 straight weeks. Like, these guys start to fold a little bit at times. And he didn't get off to a good start. He couldn't get anything going. He had a fumble. And after that, it was like, it was done. And he was out of the game just that fast. And that is going to be a big decision point, because I think had Ollie Gordon had the game we would expect him to in the carries and touches like he should have against, UCF, I think we'd be right back to be like, yeah, he's 8.8, but how am I going to fade him? No. And now it's actually a decision point where he's probably going to be sub 30%. If he had a big game last week, he'd be back to 60% even at 9K, which is ridiculous to think about a running back at almost 9K. But I'm not panicking, man. I'm really not. Like I said, Houston's defense, while not quite as bad as UCS, they're not good. They're giving up almost 170 yards on the ground. So as long as there's no hidden injury or some I don't know, maybe that game Ollie Gordon's girlfriend broke up with him. I maybe had a hangover. I'm just obviously trolling a little bit, but unless something like that's going on, or we get news prior to lock, yeah, he's got a hammy, he can't go, or he's playing hurt, okay, then I'll back off. But otherwise, there's really no reason not to play one of the best, if not the best running back in the country. Now, I know it's an opportunity cost at 8.8, but I feel more comfortable paying up for running backs than I do wide receivers, because at least I know they're going to touch the ball. Can't guarantee the wide receiver is going to touch the ball. I guess Harrison's the one 9K receiver where I can be like, yeah, he's going to get targets. But for the most part, you really can't say that with a lot of that higher price receivers. Tez Walker could easily get blanketed and have nothing, 2 for 10. And that did happen a couple weeks ago. But with Ollie Gordon, at least I know if I pay 8.8, I'm going to get something out of him. Will I get enough to register and actually warrant that price point? That might be another thing entirely. But Houston is going to do their best to just lay down and let him run wild. I can almost guarantee that. Alan Bowman at 7.1 actually makes sense, because here's what I think. If you're going to fade Gordon, because I know it's at a steep price, then you almost have to play Alan Bowman. And I know that might confuse some, but they're going to score points. If Gordon's not going to do it, then that means Alan Bowman is, because they're not going to have another running back come in and take 30 carries. And if Gordon's going to struggle, then that means Bowman's just going to throw 40 to 45 times, which he's been doing. 36 last week, 42 the week before, 34, 36, 41. He's been throwing a lot. Even with Ollie Gordon kicking ass, he's been throwing a lot. So if Gordon's going to suck now, then Bowman might be liable to throw 50 times. He doesn't run, so he's a statue, but he's only 7.1. And if he throws for 350 and 4 at 7.1, he's paying off. So that is one angle to take there for a Ollie Gordon fade. I don't necessarily recommend fading Ollie Gordon. I realize that, I always preach we got to have a short memory and just go back, but in DFS it's hard to do, and you hang on to poor performances. So that can be something we use as an edge or an advantage over the rest of the field. Because if people are jumping off a guy like Ollie Gordon that fast after one bad performance, then I have no problem running right back to him. I have an analogy I was about to use, but might not have been appropriate, so I won't say it. But I'm going right back to him for sure. The wide receivers there for Oklahoma State, there is a myriad of options. The Rashad Owens has been kind of the most consistent lately when they've been super banged up, and he's really kind of climbed the charts. He's second in targets at 67 now, but he's about to pass Presley if he continues on. Another 11 targets to his total there last week, 6 catches for 85 yards. He's been targeted 11 plus times in 3 of his last 5, 7 plus in 5 straight. So he will continue to get heavy volume there from Bowman. I know a lot of people were on Presley last week. He had 5 for 52 on 9 targets, so he didn't really deliver. That one was interesting. I think it was just because Presley kind of, matched up well against UCF. He was only 5'8". Now he's 5'5", so that makes me think we may see a chunk of ownership back on him again, since so many people were. I mean, there was like 20 to 25% ownership on some places on Presley, which was quite a bit more than I was expecting. But I do think the Oklahoma State receivers could see a nice chunk here against a really porous Houston defense. Since Leon Johnson burned his red shirt, he's been kind of the guy that I've had my eye on. He did deliver another suitable performance, 6 catches for 61 yards in their last game. He has had 12 plus fantasy points in 3 straight since he started playing, and at least 5 receptions in each as well. So he would be the one I'd play even like in front of Owens, because it's another discount. But you might have the salary because there is so many cheapies. You might be saying like, hey, I've got 6K. Why don't I just play Owens? Like in that case, I would say so. But if money's an issue, then I would take Leon Johnson there above all. Even if like Bray or any of the other guys come back from injury, I think Johnson's here to stay for at least a couple more weeks before the season ends. So the Oklahoma State passing game, it makes sense to attack if you're not going to go Gordon. I'd have to do some more investigating and detective work here to see where others in the industry are going with this one, but it is a game that I think could determine, who ends up cashing and who doesn't, based off what the decision is with Ollie Gordon there. So before we move on, this is a good, we haven't had to really banter about too many games because it's been a pretty straightforward slate, but this is one I do want to get your take on. So are you 9K Ollie Gordon? It's basically simple. Are you jumping off as well, or do you feel like, no, I'm going back, because he does have 200-yard upside in this matchup. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great spot to go back to him. It was like, it wasn't just him. Everything about Oklahoma State was just wrong. And like that happens in all sports. Some days you come out flat or wrong, and you get your teeth kicked in and pack it up and you go fight the next week. I think that lower ownership is the only takeaway from that. I don't think that like he all of a sudden forgot how to play football. I don't think that they all of a sudden are going to abandon their game plan. I think they're going to, if anything, go out of their way to get him involved early and, get the lather going and get him performing to the level that he's obviously capable of. So if you can get to the salary, that's the component of it that's tough, is being able to afford him in the lineup. But I have no trepidation about like him being able to perform and put up a big game. It's just with all of the other pieces that we've talked about, can you get to him at that salary?
Definitely. All right, so let's talk cores. What are you looking at for your core here on Thursday evening of Week 12?
Yeah. So I usually am pretty convicted at this point. I'm less so in this particular one. But I think I'm gonna go with Dylan Gabriel. I'm gonna go with Kendall Milton, which is probably not a core piece that most folks will use. And then I'm going to go with Elijah Badger at the receiver spot.
I love it. Very contrarian this time. So for me, I'm like I said, going right back to McLeod. I feel like he should be super chalky, but maybe doesn't project to be. Audric Estime, a running back, and then receiver. I don't have a real passionate feeling about any of them, but it will be one of the JMU receivers, most definitely. So pretty boring there, I know, but sometimes it's that simple. Getting over to FanDuel real quick just to provide a player pool. Brady Cook's 10-2 over on FanDuel going up against Florida. Really, really like him there. Your guy John Rice Plumlee at 10K going up against Texas Tech. Love that one. Those are two of my favorite quarterbacks on FanDuel. Then we got my guy Taj Brooks at 9.8 going against UCF. Like I said, UCF's rush defense didn't suddenly become the Iron Curtain. They're still horrible. And Taj Brooks should get 30-plus touches in this one, I think. And if he does, he should obliterate them. So he's easily the top running back on the FanDuel slate. Like Gavin Sawchuk there at 6-1 on FanDuel. That's a really cheap price on FanDuel. I think that just makes way too much sense. Cody Schrader's 10-5, really expensive, but he's approaching Ollie Gordon status. Like, we almost have to play him. And you have a decision there on FanDuel because you have Ollie Gordon at 11K, Bucky Irving at 10K, and Cody Schrader at 10-5. So you've got them at every price point there. And I think you probably do want to play at least one of them, but you have to make that decision. Also on that slate is the Texas game, which we know we didn't get a chance to talk about it because, they're not on the slate, so it wasn't as if we had to bring it up. But Jonathan Brooks of Texas is out for the season, which means CJ Baxter, the talented, highly ranked recruit freshman, will be back in RB1 status, and he's 7-7 on FanDuel. So I know Iowa State's maybe not the best matchup on paper, but he is a dude, and I thought for sure he might have taken the RB1 gig at the beginning of the season. It was him, not Brooks, that I was kind of angling for. So now he gets his chance regardless of how tough we think Iowa State is. And it's not as if their defense is as good as it's been in the past. And then at the wide receiver spots, Xavier Legette against Kentucky is 8-7. Really like him. I mean, the Kentucky defense has a reputation for being good, but they've seemingly just completely fallen apart. It's tough to really trust them at all. Xavier Worthy, 7-2 on the Texas side. Feel pretty good about him. And then there is a value to be had for Kentucky and Berrien Brown at 5-5. Usually can't get viable receivers on FanDuel for that cheap, but he makes a ton of sense there. And then you have the Houston receivers, Manjack at 7-2, Samuel Brown at 7-4. Both of those guys are in play as well. We'll have some more FanDuel plays in the main slate article that will drop tomorrow afternoon as well. All right, let's move over to PrizePicks, and then we'll do some props and get out of here. I have three that I've pulled from PrizePicks, so I'll give you a second to get yours ready. But they're all rushing yards, and Taj Brooks, I know this is a high one, but over 132.5 rushing yards. It's just simple as they're playing UCF. I just won all over that. They have a combo prop for him at 146.5, but he doesn't catch passes. So I don't want to add the extra yardage to my total if I don't have to. So I'm just going to take the rushing yardage and roll it. In that same game against Texas Tech, RJ Harvey's rushing prop is 102.5. I'm taking the over in that as well. Brooks and Harvey are going to battle. This is going to be a fun-ass game to watch for sure. And then Ray Davis, your guy from Kentucky, anytime he's got a total under 100 yards, I kind of feel like the over's got to be in play. It's 97.5 rushing yards there. So I'm taking that over 97.5 and running with it there and feeling pretty good about it. So South Carolina's pass defense is horrible, but also their defense in general is horrible. And I feel like Ray Davis should be able to run all over them. So those are the three that I'm on. What are some of the prize picks that are optimal for you this week?
Yeah, so I'm going to go Jaquindon Jackson over 60.5 rushing yards. I think we're going to see enough volume to get him closer to like an 80 as the expectation. So like that over. Where is Elijah Badger, big surprise. We got him in the core. We talked about him a good bit already. Over 5 receptions. I think he will at least double that. So we'll take the over on that as well. And then like to always do somebody on the any kind of touchdowns. We'll go ahead and use you're on, not on main, but on the later slate. Your guy Penix over 2.5 any kind of touchdowns, and he actually did run one in last week, right? So we're probably looking pretty good there if the offense shows up over 2.5 touchdowns.
Yeah, I love that. Usually I'm hitting his over 2.5 passing, but to get any touchdown like that just gives you that much more certainty because he's normally good for at least 3 touchdowns. I know lately there's been some hit or miss with the Huskies offense and they've relied on the run a little bit, but yeah, that's one I can get behind. So love to see it. All right, over on DK, where I do most of my props, there are a few sticking out here. The Jaquindon Jackson play of Utah, they have his rushing yards at 60.5 at -115. Definitely feel like, he's going to get those looks. They're going to use Vacky more as an H-back tight end type than Jackson with 20-plus carries. Should be able to eclipse 61 rushing yards quite easily, at least I think. So that's one that I really like there. SMAs is 101.5 against Wake Forest. I at -115. I am also taking the over there. Just really confident in him this week. I know he had a kind of a down week there, but he's usually good for like $120 on most games. And this is just a spot for him where he should coast into that with 20 touches relatively easy. So that is one that I'm all over there as well. They made the Brooks and Harvey props pretty high in terms of their odds, so I'll leave those alone since I had them on PrizePicks. But Kansas State going up against Kansas this week. Kansas is a pretty trashy rush defense as well, and people seem to forget that. Giddens has been the more exciting play of the two, and Treshaun Ward has been scoring far less or getting far less usage, I should say, but he does score touchdowns. There are some merit for Giddens' rushing yards total, which is 87.5. I'm looking at the over there. I think he's going to have a really big game and kind of separate himself a little bit there as the season starts to wind down. And then we have an anytime touchdown. Let's get that pulled back up here. All right, for Texas at Iowa State, CJ Baxter, it's -130. Usually for RB1s, they have him like -300 or higher a lot. So we're getting a tad bit of value there at -130, stepping into the starter role. Granted, again, I know it's Iowa State, but I'm not too scared, honestly. There might be a Judean Blue appearance there, but I think Baxter finds the end zone here, and it would behoove them to get him going early and often and really build up his confidence. So that's where I'm going on the props this week. There will be a props article drop tomorrow afternoon as well. That brings us to the spot in the show where Jake looks at his encore performance from the Jalen Milroe call last week, but he will give us a player and a stat line to win you a GPP. And nothing could be better than that Ray Davis call, honestly, from earlier. That was outstanding, but the Milroe call was pretty good. So what are you following that up with?
Yeah, man. So just going to continue with the theme of, volume and concentrated pass game in a team that's going to be chasing 1 billion points. We are going to go with Elijah Badger for 15 catches, 200 yards, and at least 1 touchdown, possibly 2.
I love it. They're going to be throwing it to him. Gotta love it. Gotta love it. Awesome. Well, no one could doubt you at this point because you've been running super hot. Got to get him in GPPs, if not your main at this point. That will wrap it up. We remain super efficient these last couple of weeks. There are just a few weeks left of the regular season. We will be doing shows for each and also content. Then we'll be into conference championship games and bowl season, and you can rest assured that we'll have content for all of that as well. I'll be back here tomorrow night for the CBB version of the show, 9 p.m. PST, and then Saturday morning for the pre-lock CFB show, talking about any last-minute news, injuries, all that good stuff. And then next week, Thanksgiving approaches, so you can expect the CFB Super Show to be one day earlier than normal, which will be Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Thanks to everybody who tuned in. Thanks to Jake as well. Lots of good information out there. Appreciate all of you guys who continue to support the show. And we'll see you next week for another edition of the CFB Super Show. Later.